This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board, and we're almost done with another month. It is July the 30th, 2017, and this is the Prairie Monk, which is WEFT's weekly look at the environment, rails, trails, greenways, and all the other fun stuff that's been going out there, especially stuff happening right now and in the past week.
This week I want to talk about rail trails because they're very popular across the country. There's now about 30,000 miles of rail trails, and they've proven to be structures that save the railroad beds, but they also give communities economic boost. They improve property values. They provide for recreation and preservation of habitat along the corridors, and generally speaking, they bring communities together. We are very familiar with people who are now biking across the country, and they may be interested in doing that as fast as they can, or they may be interested in just stopping off here and there and seeing what your community is like and what you do and how you have fun. So I want to talk about Heartland Pathways, which is a 33-mile purchase in the Monticello area, and it has huge potential. It's getting some consideration from the fact that we now have almost finished the first phase of the rail trail from Urbana to Danville. It's between Urbana and St. Joe, and it is wide. It takes out some of the vegetation, but it is also going to change the nature of communication between Urbana and St. Joe, and later to Muncie and Fithian and to Danville and Kickapoo State Park, from whence it gets its name. We'll talk about that probably next week with previous Mayor Daniel McCollum. He has already written a trail guide to Kickapoo State Park, and he will be discussing that. And he's also ridden the Heartland Pathways corridor when the tracks were taken out and you could still ride a bicycle on it. At the moment, it's undeveloped as a trail, except in some places. We'll be discussing this more in the future. To let you be in the picture, we're on radio, and we're talking about communities where we badly need maps. So if you'll tolerate me, I'll try and say where this pathway, Heartland Pathways, is. It lies west of Champaign-Urbana by about 20 miles. It is in 3 segments. One is between Monticello and Cisco. One is between Whiteheath and Seymour, and another is between Whiteheath and Clinton. Those 3 rail beds, abandoned, are on the end of 7 miles of railroad bed that was retained with the rails on them so that the Monticello Railroad Museum could use them as their main line, and still does use them as the main line. The museum is a very active museum. It's national level Museum. It used to run on re-railed interurban bed, and this is much better to have the main line, and it allowed them to move into the Monticello. Still trying to keep you in contact with reality. Imagine that you're in a helicopter or in a plane and you're looking over. This was a railroad bed that was used heavily in railroad days. As it got towards the end of its career, it was a railroad bed that provided services for Champaign to Bonneville, Seymour, Whiteheath, then went through what is now the Railroad Museum to Monticello, to across the Sangamon River to Cisco, and past Allerton Park, and then to Cisco. And from Cisco, the line has been retained from Cisco to Decatur. Then that train would go up on the west side of the Piatt County to DeWitt County to Clinton, and then would come back to Champaign via Weldon Springs, Clinton Lake, Lane, Weldon, DeLand, Lodge, Shady Rest, and Whiteheath. So the Railroad Museum, in its wisdom and very wisely, bought two Ys. These are areas that are like a triangle so that you can turn a train around or you can send a train in a different direction. So at Whiteheath, if you're standing at Whiteheath, you can direct your train to Champaign or to Clinton. It would traditionally come in from the Clinton line and return to Champaign. The beds were closed out at different times, and they're in different places, and that Y is in between the connection between Heartland Pathways area to the east and the area to the west. But this is sort of a cooperative territory. We're glad that the museum has that rail there, and we did not buy the elevator plots. They needed their elevators for their grain distribution, so it's not necessarily a contiguous bed. In some places, from Whiteheath to Clinton, that is the case. And so it has tremendous potential. It's the sort of resource that will be available for many generations. The cost at the outset is fairly serious, and the loss, if we don't do something fairly quickly, can be catastrophic because it can be invaded or taken out of circulation. So we're concerned that you know about this resource, and that's up to those of us who've had a lot of involvement to let you know. So why would we buy 33 miles of railroad bed? What are some of the things that you would think about? Well, let's look at railroading in the first place. Railroads are economic in the use of energy. They move trains with low use of gas. Unfortunately, these abandonments have happened in an era when prices of gasoline were low, and the subsidies for roads in Eisenhower era, roads and airlines and canals were fairly high. So the road traffic is in competition with the railroads. Also, the transport that's on roads doesn't really have to pay for the damage that they do to the roads. That's coming out of your taxpayer base, because heavy-duty semi-trailers are not kind to roads. So we're looking at rails, and I suspect Top Flight Grain, who owns the elevator at Cisco, would have had the right to speak for the railroad bed that came through to Monticello. It could then connect to Norfolk Southern Railroad or go south to Top Flight facilities in Beaumont. If you're looking at the economics of railroading, if you have grain and you can take it out to Decatur on an ICG, Illinois Central and Gulf Railroad, that's one outlet. If you go the other direction, you can go to Norfolk Southern and the Wabash, and you have a different outlet. If you only have one outlet, you don't have the chance to bargain prices for the removal of grain. So sometimes prices on a one-track line that only has one outlet can be higher. But Top Flight Grain had the chance to retain this bed and didn't, so that was available for purchase. If you come from Cisco, you come to Armenia. Armenia was a historic site where Sam Allerton was providing food for the Union armies in Civil War. And he made a lot of money doing this, and he's bought land in Iowa and Illinois, and there's a town, Allerton, in south east Champaign County, which is also Allerton territory. Sam Allerton gave his son the land, and then later Robert Allerton donated that land to the University of Illinois. But we go past Sam Allerton's elevator. We had hoped to retain that wooden elevator with the like of 17-inch beams in it and history. It was unfortunately burned recently, partially because it's felt that that sort of structure is a liability. You could climb up the top and fall down. In many cases, these old wooden elevators are eliminated, but this was if we're thinking about why would we buy a railroad line, we bought it partially because of the elevator that was on our right-of-way. So it's rather disappointing to lose that elevator and to lose the Sam Allerton history. There were houses. One was a corn country crib, which is like square all round and two-story, or a Illinois, Indiana, Iowa house, which is the sort of house that's longitudinal with a kitchen at the back and front. That's not very often used because in this area you take your car to the back of the house. So those houses, to some extent, were part of a complex of history, and that was part of the reasoning why to buy this line was to buy that history. It had outbuildings, machinery sheds, which we thought were ideal and natural for kiosks for people to get an idea of farming in Illinois. It's unfortunate that actually people can come to the University of Illinois and leave it not really understanding the farming community. It's out there, they have their things to do and they come and go, but to provide an opportunity for people to understand farming is part of why that land was attractive. The University of Illinois ground, which used to be Sam Allerton's, had on it walnut trees that have probably been there since Sam was putting up an elevator. You have to know that the elevators on these birds were usually 5 miles apart, because that's about as far as a horse could drag a cartload of commodity, corn, usually, to a railroad. The elevator was small. It usually took about 15 cars, and they were cars that weren't loaded from on top. They were cars that you would load sideways almost, and you keep putting boards up till the car was full. The early cars were wooden and kind of dangerous. If they got into a crash, they would break up. So we have history there, and we miss the fact that the elevator has gone. And that's what happens when you leave things around for a while. If you're going to develop, you have to develop quickly, because it's felt that this was something you were going to do and it should happen immediately. But often you don't have the money to do that. So this corridor has set for some time. But the area outside Allerton Park is loaded with prairie species, and the right-of-way, which is about 100 feet wide usually, has relatively undisturbed soil on either side of the ballast. The ballast can be a trail, but we're very reserved about that being a trail, because there's a policy of making trails that are one size fits all, and they're extremely wide, and they take out all the remnant prairie that we have. So that corridor has 3 culverts that go across it and work their way towards the Sangamon River. They have and on each waterway there are rather wonderful array of prairie plants that have grown there in their own way for the best part of 7,000, 10,000 years. So at Wildcat Creek, which is one of these culverts, there is horipocoon and a bunch of other plants that say this is original prairie. It also says that if it was disturbed at the time, the settlement was mainly for pasturing cattle, and the prairie could come back if necessary.
Quick question. So you're saying, okay, it's great to have all of this one-time railway, but I don't want this to get turned into a rail trail, because then it's going to be 10 feet wide and there won't be any of the prairie left. Understood. Can you see any way that it could actually be used other than just leaving it the way it is? That would be acceptable to you, of course.
Yes, I'm not sure that we can do it, because there's ADA, American Disabilities Act, and EPA, Environmental Protection Act, regulations that are about the creosote that's in the rail bed and the need to cover it, or the term is cap it, and to make sure that no creosote runs down the sides. So very easily you can lose all that prairie. So at the instant when we were standing there to try and figure out whether this was a worthwhile place to preserve, Yes, we were thinking of a trail, but we were thinking of a 4-foot trail, not a 10-foot trail. And we were, since then, have become somewhat convinced that that shouldn't be a trail at all unless it's a one-way trail with about a 2-foot corridor, and the prairie is what we want to save. These areas, the state was 2/3 prairie, and we have 0.01% of remnant prairie preserved by the state. There's a few other little dots here and there, but we don't have much left. So this is an important corridor. It's adjacent to Allerton Park. Allerton Park, in its wisdom after the purchase, with Fran Harty's help, he's a Nature Preserves Commission person, but he's also been a Illinois natural resources person, went to the university, and the university willingly put in 1 mile of prairie that was 66 feet wide. Why did they do that? That's because they found endangered rattlesnakes on that, endangered eastern Massasoit rattlesnakes, which are not so common. They're not aggressive. You can almost sit on top of them and they do not object. Not really, but they're not common, but they are in Allerton Park, and they were found on this railroad bed. So that made that 4 miles of prairie very interesting. And you have to know that eastern Massasoit rattlesnakes like water, and they will tend to move down a creek to the stream, which in this case is the Sangamon River. So we were looking at the fact that there were some road crossings, and there was some potential road crossings, and we were sympathetic that there were rattlesnakes there that some people fear and other people are very proud to see that they're there. They go along with the prairie plants that are on the edge at Wildcat Creek. Not always understood by the roadside people, because the contracting means that the contractors don't always understand the problems. If you are a contractor, you're not wanting to work with rattlesnakes, so there's a fear. But if you are a biologist, then you will want to preserve the dignity of those creatures. And what happens when you put in a new culvert, which has happened in three creeks in that area, you tend to want to get rid of the remains of the old corridor, and unfortunately in the time that this has been sitting there, the culvert material was plonked right on top of rather nice prairie restoration. We also, at the time of purchase, didn't have a autumn olive tree, which was brought in by the Department of Conservation, so then called, as an olive tree that provided seed for birds, and it was a bird strip and very popular, but it has become an invasive weed tree, and it takes over the prairie, so we have to deal with that. But we still have that area of 4 miles. As you get to the river, you have the potential for bottomland forest, and there's a little bit of morainic area. We in Champaign County especially has a very flat territory, not too much rolling territory. But the Cerro Gordo moraine provides some interest in that area. So Monticello City has, since the purchase, gained an easement from us 2 mile of rather nice rail trail. They have taken the bed and capped it, and they've made it more narrow than the standard national ASTO, the engineers that are associated with this sort of planning. It's narrower, and the trees float over the trail and make it a nice walkway, and the bridge has been and the trestles have been capped or covered with a bridge on top of a bridge, and it joins Old Town Monticello with the subdevelopments on the west side of the river. Just to stand on the bridge and look down the river and up the river is kind of relaxing and wonderful, and people can ride a bicycle and walk across that corridor without having to go on Bridge Road, which is the access to the cloverleaf, which actually attracts some people to the west side of the river, because in the long run it's anticipated there will be gas stations and other businesses near the cloverleaf. Hasn't happened quite yet. There's a little bit of that sort of development. There are bottomlands development. There's been soil and water conservation, and the city has been interested in flatland reforestation with native species, and they are growing well. So we're still looking at Monticello. We're coming from the west, which from Cisco to Monticello. Cisco in the other direction goes to Argenta, Oriana, and into Decatur, into Green Switch, Decatur. And if you're thinking about bicycling, we're thinking that this is a highway that parallels the roads, or the railroad. The railroads came first, the roads came later. And this is old Route 47, which was the highway to Decatur. But Interstate 72 has been put in, and most of the traffic is there. So you have a rather slightly used highway that has some locations on it, like where they used to store gravel and things like that. It could be a visitor center. And it goes through small communities, and you reach a place like Decatur, which has its own bicycle ways, and this would allow networking between Monticello and Allerton Park and Decatur. And all other sorts of places like Friends Creek, where we've had Bruce Hannon on board, and he's been discussing the fact that there was an attempt to dam parts of Friends Creek and Allerton Park and partially destroy Allerton Park, and that was prevented. And that sort of terrain is there, so Friends Creek is still there as a parkland. And so there's a nice rolling area. You go south of Cisco, the river runs through with a tall embankment. There was a country club there, and just properties along the river. So as we dream what might happen to this corridor, there's also how does the Allerton area relate to Kirby Hospital properties and areas that are on embankments that face the Sangamon River and are loaded with understory herbs in spring. Just marvelous little places. There's a shell there where musicians came in their day with country music, and when you couldn't go fly to a new place, you could travel with your horse to these locations. So how do they fit together? We don't always know when we first look at these areas, but the trail potential is real from Monticello to the subdevelopments of Monticello. But then we would like to think that bicycles, at least, could share the road into Decatur. There's now a library. There was a donation of $2 million to a library, and it's been placed at the end of this trail. It's there's also a 30-acre sports retreat area where you could get a number of different teams together to play ball, and you would. So these things are starting to add together. Those subdivisions can get out onto 57 and get into Champaign in 25 minutes. So there was a desire to have a road crossing. The natural area people are very aware that people like to have lots of road crossings, but they take out the contiguity, the ability of animals and bacteria and whatever to move along a corridor and survive. So we challenged that thought of a road cut, and eventually we had a debate with the city of Monticello about putting in a road cut there, and we had to debate that in the context of the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission, who understood very well what we were talking about and how we would like rattlesnakes to move through that area if necessary. So what else? We get into Monticello. We have an old town. It's historic. It has a county seat. It has a jail. It has a pepsin factory. And it's all on several railroads. There was Norfolk Southern coming north and south. There was ICG, Illinois Central and Gulf, going east-west. And there was also a parallel interurban Illinois Traction Company railroad going through the town. And so the town is there with its why and its ability for a railroad museum train to get out onto the main line at Norfolk Southern. So the railroad museum is not landlocked, and we're looking at all these resources to see who does what and where. There were a nice little cemetery with the history of the Piatt County and the Piatt family. And the Piatt family was involved with an industry, which was the pepsin industry. Dr. Caldwell, who was a nabob in the Monticello area, he'd birthed X number of children. He was part of the thing. And he squeezed pepsin enzyme out of Seneca leaves, and he did it in the basement of a building on the square. So this was providing a pepsin that would be very helpful with people's alimentary canal. It would prevent diarrhea, and it would be helpful in the matter of constipation, and people didn't have all the facilities we have today for a range of food and the like, so this was very popular. So Mr. Hott and others got to be entrepreneurs in this, and they got together with a Piatt family house and developed the product, and then eventually they had a factory which was E-shaped with the old house in the middle and a water tower and 5 stories on one side and 3 stories on the other, 2 stories. And they had up to almost 300 employees there producing a pepsin that was had a railhead for loading. This was a batch process. You put your alcohol and your pepsin and your other products in on the 5th floor, and then it dropped down and you mixed it and processed it and packaged it, and it went out. That was put in perhaps in the late 1800s and continued till the mid 1900s. It was an entrepreneurial thing. So Monticello became a wealthy corridor. State Street was a millionaire row, and this product was selling around the world. The product dealt with a development which is known in economic circles, where you invent something, and Dr. Colwell didn't want to be the promoter, so a gentleman named Hott was one of the leaders there to do that, and so you go through the family of developers, and that may be 2 generations, but by then the progenitors have moved into another generation, and they get degrees and they go off and they do their own thing, and you're dealing with a factory which is has a product where you put stuff in a spot, whereas most of these processes these days are continuous processes. So there was a sale of the factory to Glenbrook Laboratories, and then eventually it got to be in, I think the Bayer company eventually bought it as a multinational, and by that time there were 8 products being produced there. Very interesting storage and computerization of processes. At the time when we were looking at the railroad, we were also looking at the pepsin factory as a prime candidate, as an example of early economic development, which has its roots in rural areas that were different from city areas. So we figured this was part of dreaming about the railroad. It's called a grayfield. It's a factory that becomes obsolete. So it has been empty for quite a while. It had vandalism problems. It needed perhaps $250,000 on the roof. But when you're looking at Monticello, you're looking at a factory, and you're looking at an old jail, and you're looking at a square that is intact, and that's interesting. If you look at the interurban that came through Monticello and was there till 1950s, it went straight down to Bement, 8 miles adjacent to the road that goes straight down to Bement, and then it went parallel to the Wabash Railroad through to Decatur. But it was almost bought by the Railroad Museum until you couldn't get past the Bement Cemetery easily. So the regulations were that it was the right-of-way would not be wide enough. So they bought interurban land to the north of Monticello, but the system was there, the history was there. Actually the 8 Mile can be a prairie preservation and a trail. Unfortunately, it now gets mown, which is that neatness syndrome, which takes out your native vegetation and makes it an acceptable weedless territory, but it also can be very sterile. So we were looking at that corridor too. And on the east side of Monticello, the city, in its wisdom, has bought the interurban for a mile or so towards the Railroad Museum. The Railroad Museum main line comes into Monticello adjacent to that. So once again, another resource. And then you go, the rail trail finishes at Valentine Park, which is very near to a Monticello cemetery, which is loaded with history and wonder of the people who developed the area and the people who have come by recently and our bedroom community people. Just a wonderful piece of history. The Railroad Museum people, we didn't know this when we were trying to think about the resources, but they hold up a train there opposite Valentine Park and climb on the train and bully each other, and it's a little bit of drama for a trip to Monticello, on the 3-mile trip to Monticello. On the other direction, you can go up to White Heath, another 4 miles. And every once in a while, a train goes up there, and on July 4th, there's fireworks, and you can actually go by train and watch the fireworks from the train. And they still have the old parallel interurban with its rails on. The Railroad Museum has a lot of real estate or equipment, and they don't cherish the idea of a trail going through there. But once again, we're looking at how you get bicycles into Champaign. So we think to go around the Railroad Museum. At the moment, very recently, the Railroad Museum has bought 47 acres of land there so that they can expand and do their thing without being developed. They've also bought 21 acres adjacent to Route 72. So here we are dreaming to see whether it's worthwhile to buy this land. It goes up to White Heath. White Heath is on top of the Cerro Gordo Moraine, and if you're going towards Clinton, you can go down to Shady Rest. It's just 1 mile, but Shady Rest was this wonderful picnic ground in the horse era where people would come and be on the banks of the Sangamon River, bottomland territory on the banks, and then up on the Cerro Gordo Moraine, a drier area for forest trees. And the Sangamon is going through under a truss bridge. And there were people who were prepared to not only save that bridge, but for its uniqueness, but also the bridge in Monticello, and later one in Salt Creek near to Clinton. So we got 30 miles of bed, but we got 3 truss bridges. We were lucky because mostly the bridges are removed for liability reasons at abandonment time. And we lost one bridge at Seymour, but the others we have, and they're rather wonderful. One bridge has a curl in the middle of it where the track goes sort of around a bend. And we have been very lucky to look at that area. If you go down to Shady Rest, we're wondering if in the future we might encourage the Railroad Museum or a newly formed Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad would go down to Shady Rest and perhaps take people to a Chautauqua or and in spring it's just a wonder place with herbs and so the site is now in the hands of the Piatt County Forest Preserve, and they have in perpetuity and they have tax base and they can do grants and they've put trails in there. The railroad moves right through Shady Rest, so on both sides is Shady Rest. And if a train were to take people down there, you used to do things like that, they would charge you 5 cents to get to the Chautauqua. But there's a mixture of trees that are old and trees that are young and no meet between trees, that's because it was a picnic ground with trees. And so there's just that touch of history. There's little streams that come in. If you go across, if the railroad were ever to go across the bridge, there's Madden Creek that comes in. There's several other trestles. And you go up to Lodge. And there you meet a railroad bed coming in from Chicago, the Norfolk Southern. And with a little dreaming, you could perhaps have a 23-mile circuit of railroad restauranting on the rails. So these are the sorts of things you dream about. And it's not always possible to re-rail that sort of mileage. It'd be about 3 miles. And do that because you can't. You have to, if you're going to work on a main line, you have to have a pilot to drive the train or to supervise. And that's costly, and so there's all sorts of possibilities that are impossibilities that you think about and dream about. The railroad bed from Lodge through to Land, Weldon, and Lane, it's very flat. You have outwash plains to glaciation, and this is an outwash plain, and it's poorly drained. And they're 5 miles apart. They're very traditional, and about 60% of the population used to be running the trains or running the elevator. That was the industry. These days it's slightly different. But those railroad beds are there. They're being conserved. One use for land is conservation. So we have the right to conserve. It may look like weeds because for 6 generations you've not seen a prairie and you don't know what it is. And it surely gets confused with farm weeds and farm plants. But the undisturbed, relatively undisturbed soils are there with all their microorganisms. Not everyone understands that. Some people very much do understand that. So we have that corridor, and we have the opportunity to develop it. When you get to Lane, you're getting to another river system. It has been dammed for Clinton Power Plant Lake. And you go, the railroads were rather clever. They didn't want to quarry a way through, make a straight railroad. They found a creek that had already removed the soil, and you went down the creek and across the truss bridge and then up the other side. And it has its history, and the local people know it too. If you had a heavy train and you came down into that creek, you had to get up enough momentum to get up the other side. So there was lots of bawdy language if they got to the top of the hill on the other side, they didn't quite make it. So you had to break the train in two, and it'd take all day to rejoin it again. So then on the other side, there's the Hensley Moraine, and you go up there, and the railroad bed goes through Weldon Springs State Park, and 5 miles of this corridor joins the two state parks that are very popular. So we dreamed about that too. Now come back to Whiteheath, and we have 4 miles of bed between Whiteheath and Seymour. It was abandoned very early on because there was some relationship between the unions that would run the train. So if you were going to move an engine in Champaign, you had to bring a union person from Clinton to move the engine. And that was partly the rumor that why that 4 miles was broken, so that you didn't have to do that. There are other reasons, and some of the reasons are because basically the railroaders don't want someone else buying this railroad bed for business purposes, and being in competition with other railroads. So there's a lot of stories here behind what we were thinking when we were thinking to buy this bed. Now, we formed the Scott's family, especially, who's been a lot involved with the Monticello Railroad Museum, is re-railing between Whiteheath and Seymour. We had some problems with this one because we were in our dreams thinking of a trail, but we were also wanting to retain the railroad connection. And Monticello and the city and the state wanted to buy that 4 miles for a trail. We said, fine, that would be wonderful, but we want you to reserve it as a railroad bed if it needs to come back in. The state didn't want to do that. They wanted to buy it only for a trail. But we wanted to have the rail, and we're very glad we stood on our digs for that. And now the line is being re-railed with again the dream of bringing in historic trains to Champaign. We have to think about where we might park them. Do you get as far as Seymour and you can't go any further, or do you the area between Seymour and Bonneville is in abandonment at the moment because Seymour has been taking its grain to Gibson City or Monticello. So can we save that 3 miles with the rail intact? We also lost a bridge there because we bought after the bridge had been removed. It was a new bridge, but it was removed for liability. So we have to find a bridge somewhere. Again, dreaming. And so if we get to Bonneville, we might do that. It might be as far as we get. But if we get from Bonneville into Champaign, can we work with Canadian National to park? You might notice that there's 2 railroads come into Champaign. One is the Norfolk Southern, which comes from Bloomington into Champaign and through to Urbana, and it's been taken out. It's become the Kickapoo Trail. It was Conrail. Before that was Newark Central. And so that railroad comes in, and it almost meets the railroad coming in from Seymour and Bonneville. And for those people who knew it, it's right near the old ice factory where people used to store ice for winter and sell it to people who didn't have refrigeration but used ice. So at the moment, there's been a derailment on a little piece of railroad line there called the Wabash. It was owned by the Wabash. And we could get into the warehouses that Dr. Youngerman owns just north of town, and we would love to park there. I'm not sure we're going to do that because that piece of rail that didn't go onto the main line, you didn't have to have a pilot. You could park with more simply. So now the ICG or the Canadian National goes over on the Norfolk Southern and goes onto the main line. We don't have much left, but you get an idea of what we were dreaming about when we were trying to buy that line, and we did get the money to buy it, and people who are very interested in seeing this complex preserved. And we need you to know about it because we need to develop parts of it. Parts of it have been developed, and a good demonstration is the trail between Monticello and the suburbs to the west. But think about it, and this information, I put it up on Facebook. It will be available on, give it a few days, on Urbana Public Television on Friday at 1 o'clock, and the following Tuesday at 6 o'clock, and then it is rendered to YouTube, so you can get it with the Prairie Monk on YouTube. So make yourself interested in this. It's a wonderful resource. It does things to to the communities involved. We have lost some of the resources. We lost the Pepsin factory because it looked grim, but you try to do what you can, and we don't want to lose things like the truss bridge that Monticello has put a bridge over a bridge. So I think we're near the end of the day, and thank you for listening, and do sometime go out there and have a look at Heartland Pathways Corridor. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.